So I'll kick us off with this conversation, and as people join, they will be here to learn and hear from Camilla when we get to our questions. So welcome everyone. This is a live speaker series hosted by the Learning and Development team. Today, I'm really excited to host Camilla Boyer to have a conversation about communicating with emotional intelligence. You might have attended some of our past live speaker series over the last few weeks. We've been hearing from 3 other really great speakers about emotional intelligence and what it means to have emotional intelligence as a manager, what it means to show up with emotional intelligence when we're talking about diversity. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation about emotional intelligence in communication, because in my experience at GitLab, communicating across so many different cultures, countries, and forms of communication is one of the biggest challenges. And I think we can learn a lot from Camilla and her experience with emotional intelligence and integrate that into the way that we communicate with each other. So if you haven't been to one of these conversations before, in a second, I'm going to ask Camilla to introduce herself. And then Camilla and I will go into a fireside chat with 3 questions that we've already written in the agenda. So let me grab a link to that and share it in the chat in case you don't already have it. So really welcome you to listen and follow along, take notes in the agenda as Camilla and I have this conversation. And then after about 25 minutes of Camilla and I chatting, I'm going to open up the conversation to a Q&A from anyone on the call. So down at the bottom of the agenda, you'll see there's a team member questions section. And if you have questions for Camilla that you already have thought of, or maybe that come up as we're chatting, feel free to add that into the agenda. I'm going to put one ask out there that if you aren't muted, to please mute yourself, because I can hear somebody. And okay, with that, I'm going to ask Camilla to introduce herself. Thanks, Camilla. Oh, no. Am I back? Okay, Camilla, could you introduce yourself?
Hello. Yes. Thanks so much for that great tee up. It's super exciting to be here with all of you today. So my name is Camilla Boyer. I am currently the Director of Executive Communications at checkout.com, which is a big fintech payments processing company. Communications and storytelling and messaging is my thing. It sounds nerdy, but I'm super passionate about it. And I could talk about it all day. So I've done it in a lot of different forums at this point in my career. I've done it in, fully in-person environments. I've done it in massive global tech companies where we have faced those challenges of, how do you speak to people across those cultural boundaries and geographic barriers, and how do you make sure that, the language that you're using is resonating. I've worked in a fully remote company. My company right now is hybrid. So figuring out, what are the best modes of communication for every type of office environment that you're in. Obviously for you, the fully remote is kind of the most relevant. But yeah, so my job is basically to work super closely with CEOs and executive teams to help them be great leaders and great brand advocates by helping them communicate empathetically and in a really kind of inspiring, motivating, consistent way.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Camilla. I'm really excited to learn about your experience because I feel like your position and your company now, you have a really unique opportunity to help shape so many other people's communications. And I think we have a lot to learn from you.
Awesome. Yeah, excited to get stuck in.
Yeah. Okay, so let me ask this first question and we'll get the conversation started. So first off, can you explain what it means to communicate with emotional intelligence? Why is it important to do this, and how do you go about it?
For sure. So I think communication is something that we all have to do as humans. We have different comfort levels with it, though. And so it's kind of takes a little bit more thought and consideration than we might assume. The key thing that I want to hone in on here is this common mistake where we think when we're communicating that our job is to get our message across, to say what we have to say. when actually what it means to communicate with emotional intelligence and communicate empathetically means to actually flip that and think first, who's my audience? What do they need to hear? How can I be in service to them? How can I frame my message in a way that's really going to resonate with them, right? And that's kind of the biggest point, is flipping that process and putting yourself in your audience's shoes in order to frame your message, rather than thinking, what is my message? And I just need to say it kind of no matter who I'm talking to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. So really understanding what the person needs to get out of it before you are perhaps like creating what you want to say. Seems like it kind of switches the priority.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's at scale. That's, in conferences, or whether you're talking in a meeting room of 10 people or whatever it is, as much as it is on a one-on-one basis. It's always really important to think first, who's my audience, and then what's my message.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think at GitLab, that's um, such an important thing to think about. What comes to mind immediately is when we're communicating with text-based conversations, like communicating through Slack. And it's really important to share a lot of context in the conversations that you're having, because you can't assume that, you know, Melanie has seen the issue that I'm talking about, or that Melissa has been at the conversation that I'm referring to. And so approaching the conversation with, what does this person need to know, rather than what I need to share. It's very like
Mhm.
the opposite of selfish. It's very compassionate, I think.
Yeah, completely. And I don't have a whiteboard on hand, but if I did, I would draw an axis for you that I always think about when I'm thinking about positioning a piece of communication, which is like on your x-axis, you have something that says, what do they know? And on their y-axis, you have something that says, how do they feel? And your job as the communicator is to think about both of those things, right? So, at the very beginning, this person who you're talking to, whether you're giving a conference presentation or a business update in a meeting or a one-on-one with your manager, by definition, you know something that they don't. They know less about something than you do. So you want to kind of plot that on that axis and say, okay, this is their starting point of the information that they have of what I'm talking about. And then equally, you have to think about, there's two dimensions here. You have to think about, how do they feel? So, are they going to be excited about this news that I have to share? Is this a hard piece of news that I have to share? Is this going to be intimidating for them? Is it going to be energizing? What are the emotions that are going to be associated with this piece of news? And also, how do they feel on that day? Do you know if that audience is like coming out of 4 straight hours of presentations, or if your manager has just had a really hard meeting or whatever it is, taking that into account too, right? And sort of plotting the point that they're at on those axes to understand where they are when you walk into the room with them, and then charting the point that you want to go to. So at the end of that conversation or that presentation, where do you want to move them? How do you want them to have changed how they think and how they feel?
Yeah, I really like that. And I like that visual, and I really like that it includes how they're feeling that day, because like you started the conversation saying, at GitLab we're all remote, and so you miss out on the cues that you get from people by passing them in an office, or by just, sharing space with them and understanding maybe where they're coming from based on those nonverbal cues. And so putting intentional thought into, where is this? How might this person be feeling? Like checking what messages they have or haven't sent to Slack that day, checking their calendar to see if they are coming, if your meeting with them is their 8th meeting of the day or it's their first, because understanding that kind of emotional energy can really help frame how you go about speaking with that person. I feel like there's like tools that we have in an all remote environment that can kind of clue you into how someone is doing, but it takes more effort, I think, on our part to look for those clues.
Super true.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that. That's a really great question. Okay, so I'll move us on to the second question, and I'll also remind folks, if you have questions for Camilla, you can throw them in the agenda down at the bottom in the team member question section. So my next question, it does kind of lead into what we were just talking about. So at GitLab, we communicate with a mix of synchronous conversations in Zoom and sometimes in person, and also async conversations via GitLab, where we do a lot of our work, and Slack. Wondering, can you share your experience with how we can read the room of people we're communicating with in both settings so that we can approach conversations with emotional intelligence at the forefront?
Yeah, for sure. So I think the primary thing is kind of what you already touched on is like the awareness that when you're in a fully remote environment, you have fewer environmental cues to pick up on than you might if you were kind of face to face with someone, right? I think we all know the significance of body language and things like that when you're physically sitting across from a friend or a family member and you're having that conversation. So just acknowledging that there's a little bit of a deficit there and that you have to therefore overcompensate to make up for that. So for me, like, I'm a big advocate of small talk. I think it's important. I think it's important for community building. I think it's important for relationship building, but I also have an ulterior motive, which is to understand you a bit more so that I can make sure that what I'm saying is going to resonate with you, right? And, it's great in this environment because none of you were forced to be here on this call. Like, I know that you opted in to be here because you are interested in this topic. So I factored that in. Like, I already know that I'm not in sales mode. I don't have to convince anyone here that emotional intelligence is important. This talk would sound very different if I did have to do that. I would be pulling out my research books and my scientific data and, whatever it is, but that's not the crowd that we're in. So I think having that level of awareness is really important, and then making the space up front to just give them the chance to tell you anything that you might not know. So like, it might be that, their kid is sick and they slept really badly last night, and, that does something to somebody's mood. Or it might be that they're taking a trip this weekend, they're taking Friday off, and so they're just feeling under pressure to get everything done before that goes on, or whatever it is. And just trying to stay on top of those cues, right? And making sure that you're factoring that into how you are positioning your message and talking to them. And it's easy to skip over that stuff. I think, I've worked in a fully remote environment. I was fully remote for almost 3 years. And that was actually something that I had to be super deliberate about, because you can have a tendency to kind of get straight to business when you're like, well, I'm already talking to somebody just through a camera, so what difference does it make? And actually it's completely the opposite, where you have to make more time and space for that than you otherwise would.
Mm-hmm. I've seen some folks at GitLab who have things like kind of built into their meeting agendas so that they don't forget or don't brush over that. Like there's like a stoplight method where people will indicate if they're feeling red, yellow, or green that day, and give some space to, it makes space at the beginning of that meeting every time it happens so that people are aware of how people are feeling, and that it isn't forgotten. You don't just get right to business. You have that conversation first.
For sure. And I think depending on the nature of the conversation or what it is you have to share too, I've also been as deliberate as saying, do I have your permission to give you some feedback? Or is this a good time to share an important piece of information with you, or whatever it is? Because even if you think you've done your diligence, even if you think that you have kind of done the small talk and asked the pertinent questions, there might still be something that somebody hasn't shared with you. And especially if you're going to drop something on them that is, either of significance to you or to them, you kind of want it to be an opt-in engagement, right? You kind of want it to be something that they have said, yeah, like, I'm in a good place for this.
Mm-hmm. I like that. Yeah, because there might be something that you don't share when someone asks if you're doing okay. And, you might say, yeah, I'm doing fine, but you don't really want to talk about it. And so having like a clear question, is this a good time to share feedback, or can we have a conversation about whatever, really
Right.
gives someone the opportunity to say no if it isn't a good time.
Yeah. And for them to tell you when is, or whatever it is. They don't have to explain if they have something hard going on. It's not, an inquisition, but It is just giving them that option to put it into a different time if that's what suits them better.
Yeah, right. And then I'm looking at your notes too for this question, and I'm wondering if you can expand a bit on the asynchronous part. I noticed you wrote in the document, so when you're communicating async or written, it's better to err on the side of being more positive to counteract the otherwise negative skew. I'm wondering if you can share a bit more about that.
Yeah, 100%. So this is just what science tells us, but also I'm sure we've all had that interaction where like the notorious one is like if you text somebody like okay or just like K, then people are like, oh my God, they're mad at me. Whereas like we say that all the time in real life, right? Like you go out to dinner with your friends or whatever it is, and they're like, oh, do you want to split pizza? And you're like, okay. And like it's not mad, you're perfectly fine with that, you're perfectly happy. But the truth is, when we write things, our human default when we read it is to see it as actually a bit more negative and a bit more aggressive than it was intended. So that means when you're doing your written communication, you have to soften it as much as you can. And whether that's like using punctuation, or if you're an emoji culture, like throwing emojis in there, or even if it's just like, starting with like, hey, how are you? And then moving into your question. Although I personally hate a Slack message that just says, hey, how are you, with no follow-up. I wouldn't recommend that. I would say, put your ask in there as well, but just, I guess, create a little bit of that space. So that's what I'm getting at, is just, again, it's over-indexing for the fact that the nuance is lost sometimes. And when it's a written form of communication, it is more likely to be interpreted more negatively than you intend.
Yeah, that's a really great reminder. And there's like, I think small things, like you said, starting off a conversation. Like I think of it, something that I struggle with is like when I write an email, I always have an introduction, like, I'll I'll recognize who I'm emailing, and then I'll say something nice at the end if the conversation is wrapping up. But Slack feels so much more like texting to me, where you don't do that. And so being able to take a step back and think about, okay, reread what I just wrote, and am I getting across the right tone and intention, especially to avoid like a negative slant.
Well, yeah, and it might feel weird to kind of overcompensate in that way, but sometimes I write things and then I read them back and I'm like, wow, I sound angry. I need to put an exclamation point in here or whatever it is. So I think just also like gut checking yourself before you hit send on something and saying, it's that emotional intelligence piece again. It's like, if I were the receiver of this message, how would I read it?
Yeah. Thank you. That's really great. Okay, so I have one question left, and then we'll move over to team member questions. And this question is a bit more specific to something that's like pretty current at GitLab right now. So right now, many of our team members are likely having career conversations, or career growth is on their mind, because we just finished up with our talent assessment cycle. And so I'm wondering if you can give some advice for team members, both those in manager roles and people who are a direct report in a relationship, about how they can have these career development conversations about performance and growth and approach it with a lens of emotional intelligence.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a really great question, because I'm sure everyone on this call can relate to the fact that these are some of the most like emotionally fraught conversations that we have at work. They feel very high stakes for us as the individuals, and for if whether you're in an individual contributor position or a management position, it just feels very delicate. So it's really important to kind of proceed with caution. My favorite piece of advice here comes from one of my icons in the emotional intelligence through a professional lens space, which is Brene Brown. I'm sure she will be, many people on this call will be familiar with her. And if you're not, you should definitely check out some of her stuff. But she said once, and this really stuck with me, that, whenever you're speaking, you need to think about how you can be in service to your audience and how you can be generous with your knowledge. And really what that means is going back to what we originally discussed about okay, who is my audience and how can I make sure that I'm landing this message in a way that resonates with them? How can I be in service to them? What are their goals? What do they care about? What information are they lacking? And how can I fill those gaps for them, right? And then the second piece of that is about being generous with your knowledge. So thinking, what's everything that I know and how can I share everything that might be relevant or important to them? And I think that's particularly important in these development conversations. So let's take it in two stages. The first is, being in service to your audience. So, I'll say, if I were thinking about talking to my manager about a promotion or wanting an update on that process or whatever it is, the first thing I would say is, okay, how can I be in service to my manager? I know my manager has other reports. I know my manager has their own job to do. So I know that actually keeping tabs on every piece of work that I'm doing or how I'm feeling about my job is only a piece of what they're thinking about. So how can I make sure that I'm making their life easier by surfacing what it is that I have to share about the work that I do and doing it in a way that makes their job easier to be an advocate for me, because that's what we want from our manager, right? Is for them to have the best understanding of you so that they can be your best advocate. And you do that by being the best advocate for yourself. So then the second piece of it is being generous with your knowledge. So nobody knows more about the work that you do than you do. And this is something I kind of had to learn the hard way. Maybe it's the Brit in me, but we weren't really taught to brag about our accomplishments and brag about the things that we do. But what you have to realize is that you have that information and nobody else does. So when it comes to asking for what you want, make sure that you're pulling out all of those big ticket items, all the accomplishments, all the things you think like might possibly sway a decision one way or another, and presenting that to your manager and being generous with that information. I think like that's not the time to kind of hold back and say like, oh, maybe this isn't relevant, because the thing is, if they don't know, then they can't factor that in. And that is only ultimately going to damage you. So it's about remembering to be your own best advocate and remembering to do it in a way that kind of serves your manager the best. Now, if it's the other way around, if you are the manager and you're having these development conversations with the people that work for you, it looks a little different again. So if we put ourselves in a manager's shoes for a second, what does it mean to be in service to your audience? Well, first of all, your audience is the person that works for you or is on your team. And being in service to them means having a proper understanding of what their goals are. So that means you need to be having, regular career development conversations, or at least at the start of this conversation, giving them the space to tell you that, what is it that you want? What do you think you deserve? Why do you think you deserve it? So creating the space for them to do that. And then being in service to them is like being the best advocate for them with the information that they give you. And for you, what it means to be generous with your knowledge is about, okay, here's my understanding of how the promotion or the compensation process works. Here's the timeline. Here's who is involved in reviewing these things. Whatever it is that you have to share that you think might kind of ameliorate or alleviate some of that insecurity, uncertainty that's in the person who's being evaluated. That's what it means to be generous with your knowledge. Just try to put their minds at ease and try to be as clear as possible about the process.
Yeah, thanks for that. Because I really like that we can apply the same framework of being generous and serving our audience for both sides. Because I think that if both a manager and a direct report go into a conversation about career growth and both have the intention to serve each other and share and be as open and transparent as they can, I think that those career conversations can become incredibly efficient and like really safe spaces for both people to share what they want to get out of their career growth at GitLab.
Right, right. And I think a big piece of it is creating that common language and setting those common expectations, right? So whenever I've been a manager, my MO is always to establish my expectations up front on a team. And, I always say, listen, like I view your career as my responsibility. Like I will be your best advocate, but you need to give me the tools to do that. Like, this has to go both ways. I'm not a mind reader. I have a lot of stuff going on. Help me help you, right? And I think when you frame it this way and you say, I want to be in service to you, and I will always be generous with what I know, then that kind of creates that important psychological safety moment for the people on your team, for them to say, okay, she cares, she wants to hear what I'm working on, and I know that she has the best intentions of going to bat for me. And the same thing when you're a direct report. It really is, the manager has to set that tone so that you feel comfortable, but then it's your responsibility to show up every week or to every one-on-one, however often you're having them, with that information, having done that work, and making sure that you are equipping them to be on your side.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for wrapping that up with this idea that how important common language and clear expectations are. I really appreciate that. So we have a few team member questions in the document. So thanks, Camilla, for having that conversation back and forth with me. And I'm going to pass it over to our team members to come off mute and voice their questions. And it looks like Sarah is the first one. So Sarah, are you on the call and can voice your question?
I am. Thank you, Samantha. Thank you, Camilla. I was really excited to see your session on the calendar. So my first question relates to one of GitLab's values that we call short toes that we have in our handbook. The summary of this particular value is that we want people to operate under the assumption that others have good intent. And we want everyone to be more accepting of other people's desire to contribute or provide opinions and ideas to topics that we might be the DRI or leading on. I have seen this particular value kind of used as a way to justify somebody's own response to a situation where they contributed and it was not received well. And they say, well, why aren't others having short toes? Like, why is this on me? And I'm curious how you would coach individuals who have this mindset, or how we as managers can strike the right balance between assuming, good intention, but also, presenting information in that right way.
Yeah, for sure. So you're talking about somebody who has an idea that they present that doesn't go down well. Is that right?
Yes. And then when provided critique, the individual reflects on, well, why doesn't the other party have short toes?
Yeah.
And I've seen this happen across the whole company.
For sure. So I think a really important thing there is, first of all, making sure that everybody knows that it's okay to share their ideas. Like, I think that's fine. That's, a key tenet of psychological safety to me, is like being able to trial and error your way to success. And I think that's really key. But at the same time, I think like having a clear definition of what short toes means that you can kind of counter that. It doesn't mean that every idea is going to be enacted. It doesn't mean that every facet of every job is fair game to everyone. Everyone kind of has their remit, right? And there's areas of expertise that we hire people for because that's what they're really good at. So I think what I would try to be careful of is, like, you want to preserve that trust. You want to give them the space to continue to contribute. So we don't want to chastise them, but we want to sort of flip it in a more positive way and say, hey, this is something that you're exceptional at. Like, I would love to see you kind of double down on this area. I would love to see what, if you, put that energy in this area, what does that mean? What does that look like? And kind of try to do a redirect rather than shutting somebody down, because it's a great question. It's a fine line to walk. How do you encourage people to continue to participate without, risking shutting them down when it's not always the right time and place for that feedback?
Thank you. That was great. I think, Samantha, do you want to voice your second point there?
Yeah, I was just looking through the values page as we were chatting about this, and it made me think of this like other value on that page that is collaboration is not consensus, which I think is kind of like similar to what Camilla is saying, in that like short toes exists, but that doesn't mean that everything that you share is going to be accepted as like truth in whatever project is being working on. And so like it feels like that other value is like the two go hand in hand. They like have to exist together.
Yeah. No, I mean, I love that. I think the other thing that my company uses a lot that I'll throw out there is this phrase disagree and commit. I don't know if that's something you say at GitLab, but what it really means is we're all entitled to our opinions. We don't all have to agree all the time, but we do have to be able to pull together as one team and move in one direction at a certain point. We don't have to, we don't have to have 100% consensus on everything, but we do need to be able to disagree and commit in the interest of moving the business forward.
Yeah, I think that's great.
I'll pass it on to Melissa. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for your question.
Thanks for being here, Camilla. My question's around context and how do you strike a balance with providing just enough or too much context? There are times when there's a lot of information that needs to be exchanged, and especially in an async way, it can feel overwhelming to the receiving party of just like how much they got at once. So I was wondering if you have any tips for how to do that effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key to that is that understanding your audience piece, right? So when it comes to the level of context to provide, have a think about what else this person has on their plate and what they're actually going to care about, right? I mean, I think about like when my mom tells me a story, like it can be a story about like her running into a friend at the grocery store, but it takes her half an hour to tell me the story because there's just so much context and so many details. And I'm like, Mom, like cut to the chase, which part of this do I actually need to know? And the answer is usually none of it, but like, she had a point in there somewhere. And so I think about that, in this case too, where you have to just kind of think, how much of this does this person actually need to know? Because I know we talked about being generous with your knowledge, but that is after the step of thinking, how can I be in service to my audience? So those two things have to go in sequence because one person, when I work with CEOs, they're crazy busy. Like I always think, what is the bare minimum that I can tell you that is going to get my point across? What is what is the absolute essence of my message? What are the core things that you need to know without overburdening them with stuff? So I'm a huge editor. Like I'll dump everything out there and then I'll cut back from there with that frame. And that's kind of how I would think about it, is like, yeah, I want to provide you context, but I want to provide you the context that you need, not just like all the context in the world.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
Sure.
I have the next question as well. So for managers that are supporting members of their team that are specifically looking to grow in this area, so emotional intelligence, are there any resources, like I'm thinking about like books, trainings, etc., like go-to things that are that we can share?
Yeah, yes, for sure. I'll reel off some off of the top of my head, but I will, if there's more that I think about, I'll send them to Samantha and maybe she can share them out afterwards. But I think Brene Brown has a book. Now, let me get the name for you. That I think is like, it's called Daring Greatly. She has a bunch of books, but that's my favorite one. I think that is required reading for any human being, but definitely, anybody in a professional setting, because it's helping you understand like how you bring vulnerability into a workplace. And that's really important for people who are struggling with emotional intelligence, because it's about how do you bring your own vulnerability to the workplace, but how do you also have empathy for the vulnerability of other people? And it's actually about creating stronger bonds and a more trusting environment through that lens. So to me, that's super, super key. She also has a great podcast that's called, I think, Dare to Lead, that I would recommend that anybody kind of look at. Another book that I love that I'll send Samantha the title of, but it's about humor at work. Like to me, that's a really, really important factor. And that's something that people who are kind of looking to develop in the emotional intelligence area sometimes overlook. Is it's important to be human. It's important to be able to kind of share laughter with people as a way of building bonds. And that's actually kind of like a tactical thing that you can implement, which is just like, how do I foster my humanity a little bit more in work?
Thank you. And a quick follow, well, hopefully quick follow, but are there any specific kind of like tips for someone who's like coaching someone through this, not necessarily working on it themselves, if that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the more like tactical and tangible you can be, the better. So if I were you, I would take like your favorite snippets from whatever we talk about today, whether it's like, the reframe of like thinking about your audience and then thinking about your message, or whether it's thinking about how do you be in service and how do you be generous with your knowledge. But I would say like soundbite these things, turn them into tactics that people can easily deploy, because it's not rocket science. Like these are rules that you learn and you implement. And it does take more practice for some people, but if you're given the framework and, and also like the axis that we talked about is also a useful one, right? So I think basically what you're just saying is like, I want you to learn these things and learn to implement them. You are not out there on your own. You're not going to make a misstep. You're not just like improvising every single time. Like these are frameworks that you can use. And I think like teaching those and encouraging them to use them. And then for you to be able to provide feedback when you see it not being done super well, or where there's areas that it could be done better. I think having that common language of those frameworks is really important and useful.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
For sure.
We can move on to PJ.
So first off, like I'm just excited to see this talk. Like emotional intelligence and understanding your own emotions and the emotions of others is a big part of interpersonal relationships, which as a person in kind of a forward facing role within this company, like I need to be able to talk to people, and a big part of that is emotional intelligence. I would love to hear more about ways that we can apply this to things like talks and events. I think in your first answer, you had a thing that was like, whether it's one person or 1,000, it's important to put yourself in your audience's shoes. So I would love some advice for that, because I know there's lots of people at this company that give lightning talks or event talks that this could be really useful for.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's a great question. So whenever I'm giving a presentation or a talk of any kind, I think about there being, I think about the house being the presentation that I want to build. And then I think about the foundation of that house in 3 ways. So the 3 elements of your foundation are your audience, your content, and you as a speaker. So if we think about each one of those things kind of one at a time. So your audience, first of all, is what we've been talking about. It's thinking, okay, who comprises this audience? Is it a very technical audience? Is it a not very technical audience? What sector, industry are they from? But then also, what else have they been doing today? Are you at a conference and you're the last slot of the day? Or is it, the first thing in the morning and maybe people aren't totally awake yet, or, maybe you lucked out and you got the best slot, but having that context and that awareness, I think. And then thinking, what is it? Why are they showing up? What is it that they want to learn from you? So doing like honestly a mind dump of like everything that you know about this audience and writing it down and having it kind of framed somewhere. So that's the first thing. The second thing is from there, you can say, okay, my content is this. You probably have a subject line or a title of some sort that you are a topic that you're kind of going to be speaking about. And thinking about, okay, what is everything that I know about this topic? Let me get everything out there that maybe I would want to send or say, and then doing a matching process almost and saying, how can I get this content to line up with what I know about my audience? And that's how I structure every presentation, to make sure that what I'm saying is really going to resonate. A good, additional tip on that front is to think, how can I make this? How can I frame this in an interesting way? What is the key problem or aha moment that I can share with this audience? And how can I deliver them a solution or a tangible take home, right? So, there's tons of examples out there, but I think framing it that way is really, really helpful. And then the third element of the foundations is you yourself as the speaker. And this is intentionally third because in my opinion, it's the least important. But the fact is, you are merely a vehicle for your message. That's how I view being a speaker. you are in service to your audience when you're up there. You're being generous with your knowledge. You've done the process of matching what you know to what you think they need to know and how they feel. And you are merely just the vehicle for that message. But at the same time, generally, when you're up there and you're giving a presentation of some sort, that's an impactful moment for you. First of all, it's kind of scary. You know, I do a lot of this stuff and I still get nervous when I go up and do these things. But second of all, it's probably of some significance that you have a captive audience and that they're going to know who you are and you're considered an expert in some way. And so thinking about, how do I want to come across? How can I bring to bear the best parts of myself? How can I show up as the leader, the thought leader, the motivator, whatever it is that I want to be? And I will sit down and say, like, okay, this is what I want people to think of me, and not in an inauthentic way, right? Because I think the worst thing you can do is get up and try to be someone that you're not. But thinking about, how can I dial up those parts of me to make sure that I'm showing up in an authentic and, you know, sort of saturated way. And so, yeah, when you're a speaker, that's your job too, is to represent yourself in the best way that you can.
Thank you. Thank you. That's all absolutely amazing advice. I can't wait to share that with other people that are doing talks around. Thank you.
Great. I'm glad to hear it.
Hi, Camilla. I put my question last because I acknowledge it's a bit off topic, but I reckon that you have something to say about this. In-person in in-person communication or calls, you know when the other person is going silent and just withdrawing from the conversation. In an all remote environment where you have asynchronous communication, you don't know, is that person just busy with the kids? Did the dog get sick, or what happened? Do you, since you have experience with all remote work, and maybe someone else has a good comment here, how do you deal with you know, people going silent and you not knowing why in all remote communication?
Yeah, so to me, that is a cultural thing, and that's to do with expectation setting. So I think when you're working on a piece of work like that and it's really urgent and somebody goes silent, then you need to set that expectation up front. Like if you're having a conversation or whatever it is, and they just disappear on you, you should have said at the top of the call, like, hey, this is really important. It would be great if we can, you know, collaborate together on this until it's done. And then if they still abandon you and leave you hanging, then that to me is not great, behavior. And that's something that I would, you know, considerately and tactfully give them feedback on. But I think if it's not urgent, then you need to query with yourself as well. Like, can I give them the space that they need? It might be, you know, you don't know exactly what has come up for them. It might be that some other more urgent work came up, or it might be that they signed off for the day to go be with their families or whatever it is. So if it's not urgent, then it's up to you to have a bit of grace for that person. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. It does. Thanks.
For sure. Yeah. And I think, you know, the other thing I would say on that is, I don't know what your feedback culture is like at GitLab, but I think, you know, what we talked about earlier in the session about, you know, asking permission to give feedback or finding the right time and the right avenue to do that. You know, if you can be deliberate and thoughtful about that, you can actually, you know, meaningfully change behavior in a way that doesn't make somebody feel like, you know, they did something massively wrong, and actually helps you continue to collaborate better in future.
Thank you very much.
Something I was just thinking about too, and I don't see this across the board at GitLab. I wonder if it's a team thing or if it's just a personality thing, but some people are really good at updating their Slack status about like what they're doing if they are away, like during their working hours. Other people aren't. Other people will just, you know, the green dot goes away and you know that they're not online. But I wonder if that is something at a team level that could be set as a expectation, not as like as a punishment, but as a way to help be more transparent about, okay, I know that I can't expect to hear from PJ because PJ is running to the grocery store, or, you know, as indicated by their Slack. But again, I don't think that's a norm. It's not like an expectation that you have to do that at GitLab, but something to think about at a team level.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great idea, and that's something that we toyed around a bit when I was working fully remote. I would say the one thing is you need to be careful not to create an obligation that people need to explain themselves to you at all times. So there needs to be some option, whether it's an emoji or a status or whatever it is, that just says like, I'm just busy. And I think like, as long as somebody puts something up that you're aware of so that you're not blindsided, as Torsten was kind of saying, I think as long as you solve for that piece, we still want to give people the freedom and the privacy to do what they need to do.
Yeah, that's a really great call out. Thanks for that.
For sure.
Well, we're just a minute over time, so I will wrap us up. But I just wanted to say thank you, Camilla, for coming to speak to our team. This has been a really great conversation, and I'm really excited to kind of take some pieces that you've shared and go share it out with team members who couldn't have been here. And also wanted to share some appreciation for all the team members who made time to be on this call. Hope that that you learned something new and that you also can go share something back with the rest of your team. So yeah, thank you
so
everyone
much,
for being
everyone,
here.
for coming.
Yeah, great. All right, thanks all. Have a great rest of your day.